A country ought to be driven by its national interest, and personalities are important. It's good personal relations between the leaders of two countries is always a positive thing, but fundamentally, countries pursue their own national interest. There's nothing wrong with that. That's exactly the way it should be. So President Bolsonaro, looking at our election coming up here in November, and having Brazil's interest in mind, should make sure he's got lines of communication open to the Democrats as well. Well, as I say in the book, President Trump's not a conservative. I mean, I don't mean to say he's a liberal. He's not anything philosophically. I think he has a good personal relationship with Bolsonaro. He saw him as somebody who faced kind of an entrenched opposition after years of governments on the left in Brazil, and an approach that often tried to define Brazil as why it wasn't the United States. This is not unique in our hemisphere. Canada and Mexico, with common borders, especially Canada, want to show why they're not the United States. This is perfectly understandable, but beyond this kind of ideological idea of being separate from the United States, as a practical matter, there's a lot that the U.S. and Brazil share in common, and that we could work together on. And I think that would be to the advantage of both countries. We've got oil questions, we've got trade and economic questions that really the relationship has not been as strong economically as it could be, I think, to the disadvantage of both countries. In the book, one of my concerns being that a lot of Trump's decisions in the national security field were based not on the merits of the arguments about one course of action or another, but based on his concern that he not be damaged politically if he chose an approach that the majority of Republicans in Congress oppose. He didn't want the political backlash, and Venezuela is a good example of that. He said just a couple or 3 weeks ago he'd be ready to meet with Maduro anytime, and people in Florida said, "Well, that's ridiculous. That's a terrible idea," and he backed away from it. So that's a case of where political U.S. domestic political factors drove his foreign policy decisions. And if he's reelected and therefore free of the political need to have his supporters vote for him for reelection, and that guardrail disappears, it's hard to predict in some cases what his policy would be. Venezuela is one example. Dealing with China is another example. So I worry about that, and I worry that because he doesn't follow a strategy or particular policies, that in a second term it could be much riskier for the United States. So what Bolsonaro represented was the possibility of a new beginning in Brazilian-U.S. relations, and we thought this was definitely worth exploring. Now, there were some specific issues that were of immediate concern to us both. Obviously, the Maduro regime in Venezuela and the oppression of the Venezuelan people, and the consequent flow of refugees out of Colombia into Brazil, more into Colombia, but certainly we have many refugees in the U.S. from Venezuela as well. So Venezuela, Maduro was a big subject of concern, and the risk on the other side that Kirchner would return to power in Argentina, and what that would mean for stability in the hemisphere as a whole. So there were a number of issues, how to deal with China, for example. The U.S. and Brazil are the two largest countries in the Western Hemisphere. Again, I understand the historical background here, but this possibility of better relations, closer relations, more productive relations for the people of both countries was something that Bolsonaro very much wanted to explore, and so did we.
But was Brazil a top priority for the U.S.?
Well, it certainly was for me while I was there. And, these things don't happen overnight. we had, I would say, beginning in 2019, after President Bolsonaro was inaugurated, extensive consultations, for example, on Venezuela.